by the Asian Heritage Society of Manitoba in partnership with the Japanese Cultural Association of Manitoba. We are grateful to the BC Legacy Fund Society for their financial support. So at this point, I'm going to call upon our elder, Clayton Sandy, to bring a land acknowledgement. Clayton?
Thank you, Art. I think this is about my 6th or 7th time being here. It wasn't being hard. I wouldn't have been connected with the Japanese community. It's been a real different journey for me because I didn't get connected to the Japanese community until I met Art, and that was probably about 2017. And then, of course, it makes such a big difference when people in the community start coming together, start talking. And we always say that it's all about relationship building, and that's just sort of makes the world go wrong a bit. It really breaks down a lot of barriers once you start getting to know people. And I think I told Art one time the Japanese story that he told me and the videos he showed me. I didn't see those in school. I didn't know that, but it reminded me of my own people. Just the years of treatment, something like that. So thank you for listening to me many years ago. I'd like to acknowledge that we are on the traditional land of Anishinaabe, Cree, Oji Cree, Dakota and Dene people, and the homeland of the Métis people. And the fresh water we get comes from Shoal Lake 53. So I'd like to thank you for being I'd like to thank you for being here. Thank you for inviting me. Thank you.
Thank you, Clayton. And Clayton is going to be one of the facilitators later on, so you'll get a chance to meet him later on. I'd like to call upon Deborah Takeuchi, President of JCAM, to bring greetings. Deborah?
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Deborah Takeuchi, and despite what Art says, I'm not quite the president of JCAM yet. I think my title right now is acting president, so we'll just go with that for the time being. Our AGM is on October 20th, so we'll make the decision then. So I'm here to bring greetings on behalf of JCAM, and for any of you who know the work that we do here at JCAM and at the Cultural Center, you know that this topic today is really what we do at the Board of Directors and what we do here on a daily basis. How to keep this culture center and this organization relevant to our members. Last year, we did a strategic plan for JCAM, and the pillars that we want to focus on are things like integrating newcomers in the community with the Japanese Canadian community, established community. That's one of the things we're working on. We're also working on a lot of family and youth programs because we want to keep families with young children connected here to the Cultural Center and to the cultural organization. So I was here yesterday, all day actually, because we have a very successful kids club program that we run now on Saturday mornings, which is run at the same time as the Japanese language program. So what we have is families who will come for the entire morning on Saturdays where their children will take Japanese classes, and then they participate in the kids club activities, which are a lot of cultural activities. Our next activity is actually taiko drumming, which is, it's wonderful to introduce the children in the community to these cultural activities. They get to make friends here, because these are children that they don't see on a daily basis. They go to different schools, they live in different parts of the city. So this is where they get to meet and make friends. So this is a very timely topic for us, and I'm just really interested in hearing what everybody has to say today. Thank you.
Thank you, Deborah. I was going to mention that yesterday I was speaking at a conference. It was the African Black Festival, and the topic was community and belonging, because in their communities they also have difficulty getting people involved, and they're wondering how did they go about it. They should come here actually and maybe learn from this particular center. I'd like to call upon Fortunato Lim, who's the president of Asian Heritage Society, to say a few words. Fortunato.
Thank you, Art. And thanks to Elder Clayton Sandy for starting us off in a good way. It's important that we acknowledge the land that we live on and this place that I know I call home. It's a small step to rebuilding broken relationships from colonization. So thank you again, Elder Clayton. My name is Fortunato Lim Jr. I'm a first-generation Filipino Chinese settler here. Came to Canada in 1989, and one of my, I guess, most fortunate experience would be having to meet Art and kind of getting me involved with Asian Heritage Society of Manitoba. So it really kind of set the path for me and set a path for my own understanding as an individual, my identity, but also my work and purpose. So thank you, Art, for that. Today is also the anniversary of the Japanese-Canadian redress agreement. So I want to congratulate the Japanese community and on the anniversary and the celebration of today. Although we've come a long way, there's still many more ways for us to come still. And you know what we try to do as Asian Heritage Society of Manitoba is to bring people together, to build on those relationships. And one of the main things we've been doing now with the lead of Art, as well as also building this relationship with Indigenous peoples. And so that's something that we've been working on as a society. So thank you for the invitation, and I look forward to meeting our panelists, and I'm going to pass it back off to Art. Have a good afternoon, everyone.
As Fortunato mentioned, today is a very special day in our community, September 22nd. 36 years ago, the federal government under Brian Mulroney signed the Redress Agreement, a historic redress agreement that I think has changed and altered our community in a positive way. I was at the announcement in the House of Commons, and I was in the gallery at the time when he said these historical words. I think it's really important that we repeat it, and this is what he said. Mr. Speaker, nearly a half century ago, in a crisis of wartime, the government of Canada wrongfully incarcerated, seized the property, and disenfranchised thousands of citizens of Japanese ancestry. We cannot change the past, but as a nation, we must have the courage to face up to these historical facts. Those words are very important because the 4 years of struggle was to get the government to admit that what happened to Japanese Canadians is wrong. And certainly it affected the lives of 22,000 people in a drastic way. And that type of suffering and humiliation they faced is something that I'm sure our community members who went through it will continue to remember. But the fact that the government had the courage to admit that they made a mistake and apologize to our community and offer compensation has certainly helped us overcome that particular event. For Japanese Canadians, this acknowledgement was a pleasant and unexpected surprise. It sort of came out of the blue, although the members of the team, such as myself who had negotiated the agreement, knew a month before that the agreement was made. But the Prime Minister requested that that information not be made public until he and his members who knew about this had to convince Cabinet to accept it. And so they needed the time to talk to all the Cabinet ministers. So it was a month after our initial meeting that the announcement is finally made. And I have to admit that it took a lot of courage on the part of the Prime Minister, because throughout his term, there's a lot of resistance from his own party. And I remember the day that we were signing the agreement, I mentioned to him that I'm so glad that we finally were able to have this acknowledged. And he said to me, he said, it's taken this long for me to convince my people that it was the right thing to do. And so when I think back, it really was upon the Prime Minister at the time. Otherwise, I'm not too sure whether it would have happened had it been a different person. The agreement provided compensation to Japanese Canadians whose basic rights were violated. A community fund was agreed upon to help revitalize the community. And this building here stands here because there were significant funds from the community fund that went into this building. The establishment of the Canadian Race Relations Foundation is another important legacy from our community to the Canadian public. The Canadian Race Relations Foundation was set up to combat racism that affected our community and the way it affected the lives of so many people. And finally, one of the things that we wanted was the repeal of the War Measures Act, because that was the act that was used to deprive people of their basic rights. And so in April '88, the Canadian government repealed it and replaced it with the War Measures Act, which now has become criticized over the last couple of years because of the convoy situation in Ottawa. But that was the act that was used. So in that sense, today is an important day for our community. Our agreement set a precedent for other groups that had injustices in the past. And I know that we work closely with the Indigenous community for the residential school resolution. And so it's become an important thing that always referred to when there are issues in Canada regarding injustice, they reflect back to the Japanese-Canadian agreement, which set the main precedent in our country. So as a community, we need to continue to celebrate this day as a reminder of the importance that redress is to the history of Japanese Canadians in Canada. So anyways, I just wanted to acknowledge the importance of this day. The Japanese Canadian, or JCAM, History Preservation Committee has been very busy a couple of years ago, and we created 12 vignettes on the Japanese Canadian community in Manitoba. Well, we're not going to show you all 12, but I'd like to show some vignettes that sort of reflect partly the development of our community, the importance of the apology, acknowledgement, and also some of our responsibilities that we have when we work with other groups. So our first video is called, these are very short, they're about 2 minutes to 3 minutes, and there are a number of members of the group who are here who helped with it. James was there, Junko was also part of it. They were part of the committee, and Keiko, and I'm just trying to think, I would hate to miss anyone else. But anyways, we'll start off with sugar beets, birth of a community, because the sugar beets was what drew Japanese to Canada, to Manitoba.
Without sugar beets, an active, integrated Japanese-Canadian community would not exist in Winnipeg today. During the Second World War, the government of British Columbia presented Japanese-Canadian internees with an impossible choice: move east of the Rockies and work as forced labor, or move west to Japan, a country many had never seen before. In 1942, more than 1,200 Japanese Canadian internees arrived in Winnipeg by train from British Columbia. They were to work as farm laborers for the sugar beet industry in southern Manitoba. Japanese Canadians were dismayed at the living conditions. One woman commented, "The shacks were horrible. There was no water, electricity, or insulation. In winter, when you stepped outside into the open prairie, it was freezing cold." Working sugar beets was tedious, back-breaking work. And with a short growing season, it was difficult for families to survive. Many men had to find employment elsewhere to support their families. As Japanese Canadians left the farms, they moved into areas surrounding Winnipeg, while others came with the closing of the internment camps. Harold Hirose said, "We formed the Manitoba Japanese Canadian Citizens Association in 1946 to help these Japanese Canadians and to organize social activities." This led to the emergence of a thriving Japanese Canadian community. The Japanese Cultural Centre has become the meeting place for the community. Today, the Japanese Cultural Association of Manitoba continues to provide cultural, educational, and social programs at the Cultural Centre for its members and for all Manitobans.
The second video is called Justice Road to Redress. And this sort of describes our community's mobilization towards seeking redress. No Japs from the Rockies to the seas.
Such attitudes of anti-Japanese racism culminated in the uprooting and dispossession of some 22,000 Japanese Canadians from the West Coast. They were sent to internment camps in the BC interior and sugar beet farms in Alberta and Manitoba.
It is a fact no person of Japanese race born in Canada has been charged with any act of sabotage or disloyalty.
To right the wrong, the National Association of Japanese Canadians made a decision to undertake a redress movement during the Japanese Canadian Centennial in 1977. Many Manitobans took an active role in the movement. Art Mickey became the president of the national organization in 1984 and formed a local president's committee. The Manitoba Japanese Canadian Citizens Association Human Rights Committee raised awareness to gain public support for the campaign, and the Outlook newsletter kept the community informed in English and Japanese. A public rally organized in Winnipeg featured testimonials from survivors and expressions of support for a negotiated settlement. On April 14, 1988, many local members joined others from across Canada at a national redress rally on Parliament Hill. On September 22, 1988, Prime Minister Brian Mulroney and Art Mickey signed the Japanese-Canadian Redress Agreement. The Prime Minister acknowledged the unjust suffering and apologized to Japanese Canadians, and pledged that it would never happen again. This tanka best expresses the feelings of those who were affected. Our dark cloud of a half-century dissipated. The fairest day to Japanese Canadians dawns. Our joy is unsurpassable.
Our next video is called Revitalization of a Community. So this is post redress.
Following the redress settlement of September 22, 1988, there was a great sense of pride and joy in the Japanese Canadian communities that the government admitted to historical wrongs committed upon the Japanese Canadian communities during World War II. My parents had spent the war years in the Tashme internment camp in BC, and I knew this was a watershed moment for them and for Canada as a democracy. Many community members donated monies to create the MJCCA Community Fund to assist individuals and groups to conduct projects and programs that would benefit community life. There was renewed energy and focus to bring the community together in a meeting place, especially for the seniors who had endured hardships in the early years of settlement in Manitoba. As a result of the redress settlement, the Japanese Canadian community was able to apply for funding to purchase the current cultural center, which was opened in 1991. The various programs and activities at the center, such as judo, kendo, taiko, language classes, ikebana, Japanese dance classes, and so much more, have been enjoyed by many. The community had increased awareness of human rights issues, which included support to other groups and organizations who had similar issues of redressing historical wrongs. It has been an honor to me to work with other groups to address a variety of social justice issues. Together, we can make a difference.
Our final video is called Call to Action, Indigenous Accord. And one of the obligations our redress agreement has really indicated to us is that we have an obligation to assist other people, since it was Canadians who assisted us with our own agreement. And so we always feel an obligation to speak on behalf of other people as well. And this is called Call to Action, Indigenous Accord.
Over the years, the Japanese community has nurtured relations with indigenous groups, such as collaborations between Hinori Taiko and indigenous drummers, and participation of indigenous dancers at the Japanese Cultural Center. Our relationship has been built on mutual understanding and friendship. In 2008, the Japanese community participated in the Truth and Reconciliation hearings held at the Forks. Indigenous and Japanese communities have suffered from racist government policies that resulted in the internment of Japanese Canadians and the imposition of the Indian residential schools. Both communities were deprived of their basic human rights and suffered abuses, humiliation, and dispossession. In 2015, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission released its final report that included 94 calls to action. In 2017, Mayor Brian Bowman initiated the Winnipeg Indigenous Accord and committed to engaging multiple sectors, organizations, groups, and individuals across the city to build new initiatives, partnerships, and advance reconciliation efforts. The Japanese Cultural Association of Manitoba signed the accord, along with 90 other organizations, all committed to actively working toward reconciliation. As a commitment to the accord, members of the Japanese and Indigenous communities held a talking circle in March of 2018.
In a talking circle, people share their stories and personal experiences freely, and afterwards enjoy cultural foods. It is a great way to understand and appreciate each other.
The best way to overcome racism is to hold more talking circles.
Reconciliation is getting to know one another.
Thank you, Jay, for arranging to show all of these. This is only 4 videos out of 12 that we produced. And if you want to look at the others, they're on the JCAM website. Go under History Preservation, and they're all there. So you can look at it at your leisure and share it, and let other people know as well. So that really concludes the part that I wanted to do with in relation to the anniversary of Redress. Now we're going to move into a panel presentation. So I'm going to call upon Fortunato Lim now, who will moderate this particular section. Fortunato.
Thanks, sir. All right. So we're going to move on to our next part of our program. I'm going to call up actually all of our panelists if you would like to come up and just have a seat at the front, please. So for our panel discussion, we have our 4 panelists here with us. And the theme that we are looking for is what is the future of the Japanese Canadian community? So I'm gonna give our panelists an opportunity to just briefly introduce themselves. So first off, we have James Sinnock, who's yonsei, which is a 4th generation Japanese. James, would you mind just introducing yourself?
Hi everyone. Don't want to blow your ears out, sorry. My name is James Sinnock. As I said, I'm, as Fortunato said, I'm a 4th generation yonsei. My mother's side is Japanese, and my grandparents were John and Yaina Kano, and some of you know them, they've since passed away. But yeah, I was born and raised in Winnipeg, Manitoba. I'm married, I'm in my late 30s. My wife and I have 3 young kids, a 7-year-old son, a 3-year-old son, and a 1-year-old girl. And yeah, born and raised in Winnipeg. Professionally, I am an organizational design specialist in the area of human resources. And I graduated from the University of Manitoba with a Bachelor of Commerce degree and an MBA in 2018. And I'm also an active Hockey Canada coach and a Baseball Manitoba coach. So yeah, that's a little bit of me.
Thank you, James. All right, next to James, we have Hanako Teranishi, they, them. They is also yonsei, 4th generation Japanese as well. Hanako, please introduce yourself.
Hi, As said earlier, I'm a mixed yonsei, Japanese Canadian. I currently reside on Treaty 1 territory, colonially known as Winnipeg, Manitoba. My family comes from Surrey, BC. My family were farmers. My grandma's side owned farms on Surrey on Scotts Road, and my grandfather lived in Vancouver and moved to Surrey at the beginning of the war before being relocated to Winnipeg. Currently, I am in my 5th and final year, hopefully, of my English honors degree at the University of Manitoba. I have plans to pursue an English master's at Simon Fraser University, hopefully. I work as a writing tutor and an intern at the University of Manitoba's Institute for the Humanities. And I'm also currently a committee member on the National Association of Japanese Canadians Young Leaders Committee. I'm starting my 2nd term on that committee, and I'm very excited to be a part of that and to be able to work with the community a little bit closer, especially my own community, being a younger Japanese Canadian. I've volunteered with JCAM for a while now, mostly with Folklorama and doing some other things here and there. But I've been involved with the center doing like language classes. I've done 3 years of Japanese language learning. I started Odori last year, and what else? I can't remember. There's something else. Ambassador. This year. I was the ambassador. That was it at Folklorama this year. But yeah, I think that's enough of my talking.
Thanks, Hanako. And just beside Hanako, we have Tully, who is a sansei, a 3rd generation and Japanese Canadian. And Terry, please introduce yourself.
Hi, I'm Terry. I live in Portage la Prairie right now. Grew up on the farm just outside of Portage. A lot of Japanese Canadians were working on my grandfather's farm in the sugar beet fields, of course, and that's how my mother and her family got to Manitoba from their internment in New Denver. During that time, my mother started seeing my father, who was the youngest son of Lee Tully, and they got married and had twin boys, my brother and myself. Then I so I grew up on the farm, went to university, traveled, and in 1981 my wife and I moved back to the farm where we were for many years, and since then I've retired, so I'm a retired farmer, and my wife is a retired teacher, and we moved into Portage la Prairie actually at the beginning of June, so living in town is a new experience for us. I think that's about it.
Thank you. And we have Junko Bailey, who's a issei, 1st generation. Junko, please introduce yourself.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Junko Bailey. I was born in Japan. I'm originally from Nagasaki. Grew up in Nagasaki, and part of my university days I grew up in Kyoto. And I moved to Winnipeg in '98. I was 23 years old, so ever since then I've been in Winnipeg. Last week I was in Toronto visiting my families and friends, and participated at TIFF, Toronto International Film Festival, and I found myself defending to Torontonian how great Winnipeg is. And I used to complain to my friends back then, I don't like Winnipeg, it's so cold, there's nothing here. But after living here for more than 25 years, this is my home. And I'm proud to say that I know a lot about Winnipeg, and I know a lot of great things about Winnipeg, and I could go anywhere in the world to defend the city I live and I love. I'm issei, so I'm new immigrant. I'm an actor, I'm a filmmaker, I'm an artist, and I've been serving as a JCAM board member for the last few years, and I also a committee member for a Japanese New Immigrant Committee under NAJC. So part of my visit in Toronto last week, we had a in-person committee meeting. So people from Victoria to Ottawa, people like me, new immigrant, got together and discussed about our future Japanese Canadian communities and our future generations. So I'm looking forward to having this discussion today. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay. So we have quite a range of experiences here and different age groups, so I think we are going to be learning a lot from our panelists. Some of you already addressed this question, but maybe we'll start off with Junko. What is your involvement with the Japanese Canadian community, if any, or with JCAM? I know we heard a little bit about that already, but also with the assimilation of the younger members into Canadian way of life. Do you think there will be a need for a Japanese Canadian organization to exist in the future?
Yes, so as I mentioned a little bit, I started to serve as a board member for the last few years, and I started to see a lot of changes happening in this community, the Japanese Canadian communities, because we have lots of newcomers, issei like me, with a young family, and I brought my children here today, but they were here yesterday, all morning, taking language classes and participating in the kids club and meeting other JC friends or mixed friends that they only get to see every Saturdays. And I see them running around, chatting and doing activities, and I have that warm sense of community that is getting bigger and bigger. So, and I didn't really find that importance until I had my children. I was married and I didn't have children for many years. So at that time, the identity about my background wasn't really something that I was constantly thinking about. But once I became a mother, I realized, oh, what about my culture? What about my identity? And how is this going to be passed down to my children? And because they are mixed and I speak to them in Japanese and I know they understand language and culture, but I try to visit Japan every year and I try to send them to local Japanese school to have their experience in Japan. It's more, academics are very difficult for them, I understand that, but taking a school lunch together or a cleaning session after the lunch that they all participate in, cleaning the classroom and all the cultural activity that they do, which is something that it's very hard to arrange if you don't visit. So, but I think a lot of my friends in this similar situation, having this JCAM, this center to get together and have activities and seasonal activities, I think it's getting better. And I find it more and more newcomers get involved with the activities and committee members. I think we can make it even better with the assistant of the second, third, fourth generation. And yeah, I think it's something that we could be a model for the rest of Canada. And then they all have a different, but similar challenges in each JC cultural association in different parts of Canada. And I think Winnipeg can be a really good model.
Thank you. Cool. Anybody else want to answer that question? I'm just going to leave it open. So with the assimilation of the younger members into the Canadian way of life, you think there will be a need for a Japanese Canadian organization to exist in the future?
Hi everyone, I failed to mention this earlier, but Hanako reminded me I should mention how I was involved with JCAM. So I I was previously on the board from 2018 to 2020. And as I said before, I'm fourth generation. I've also assisted Art with contributing to the Historical Preservation Committee and some other kind of volunteering here and there. My grandparents were active members of the Manitoba Buddhist Temple for decades, and I grew up going to some of the, for those of you who grew up in the 90s, the MJCCA picnics and things like that, the Christmas get-together and those kind of things. So the assimilation question is an excellent one, and if you want a one-word answer, I would say is like if there's a need for JCAM in the future or a cultural organization, absolutely, hands down. There's no question that is needed, and I think when I was on the board, and even since then, there's often this conversation that comes up about, you know, what is the future of JCAM? What's the sustainability model for JCAM? And we all have talked about, well, oh, the future generations will look different than the past or Art's generation. And that's true. That's true. But there are new waves of immigration coming, like Junko's story. There are kids like my own kids. So my wife is, she's a functional second gen. So her parents immigrated to Canada when she was very young from Sri Lanka. And so now I have kids. So my father's side is European descent. My mother's side is Japanese Canadian, but fourth generation on both sides. And I have the fortunate opportunity to witness what a first or second generation immigration story is like. And I sit back on a daily basis and realize that really all that separates us is time. So, and Junko mentioned it, she mentioned the very important word is identity. And I think that that is an important word for the mandate of JCAM and what we're aiming for in the future. And I think that it's very important for the individual as well. I grew up as a mixed ethnicity kid in Fort Richmond, south part of Winnipeg, near the University of Manitoba. And in terms of like Winnipeg, Manitoba, it was actually a pretty multicultural area of the city, largely because people, a lot of people came for education and were professors and things like that. And that's really my wife's story. Her dad was a postdoctorate math and stats professor, and we lived blocks apart. So I ask, you know, we've asked that, and I'm going to bleed into the next question, but I think going forward, what we need to ask ourselves is, what is JCAM, what is its function? And we talk about the value to newcomers and the value to the older generations, and I think it's really the same. I think at the heart of JCAM, it's an educational institution to teach people about the history of Japanese Canadians. It's in a language school. It's teaching people language. It's celebrating Japanese culture, folklorama. And I think maybe we need to pivot a little bit from how it started, and really the brilliance of this center and all the centers across Canada. So it gave a place for people to gather. It gave people a safe space to feel like they could be free to be Japanese or Japanese Canadian. But the programming out of this place is robust. Like we have folklorama, food service, all kinds of amazing events that you don't even see in other cultural centers across Canada. But what I wanted to really say is that I think we need to think of JCAM as like a vehicle to celebrate multiculturalism and educate people about Japanese culture and language, and that's kind of how you move forward. And it's a big piece of that is our own identity and the redress movement and discrimination World War II. That's a big piece. But it becomes even, now we move to the evolution of JCAM. And I think that's, I've talked too long, so I'm going to pass it to somebody else.
Thank you, James. That was very good.
Yeah, kind of building off James' pieces. I think the question of assimilation is really interesting because as a young Japanese Canadian, I know for myself and like the people I talk to in my own community, there's a strong rejection of assimilation. We do not want to assimilate into Canadian culture. We are our own identity and we want to embrace that. And so I think as like a young person, the cultural center and like Japanese organizations, whether it's JCAM, NAJC, or like the Young Leaders Committee, all three of them have a core value of promoting belonging and a place of community and gathering. And I know for myself, like growing up where I didn't have that, because like we often, like through our history, assimilation was a tool of survival. And so that is how our families survived in Canada after the war. And now as a yonsei, I know I reject, like I don't want to assimilate, I want to find my roots again. And I think the community center was one place where I found that. Like talking to Les for the first time is where I found the NAJC and I found the Young Leaders. And that's where I was able to connect with other young Japanese Canadians who felt the same things that I was feeling, where I was running in circles thinking, I'm not worthy, I'm not enough, I'm not Japanese. And then I met other young people who had those same feelings, and together, by talking to it, we instantly recognized each other. And instantly those questions of, am I enough, am I Japanese, just went away, because you're able to meet other people. And so I think that the community centers and our organizations are essential. They will evolve as time and they will fit what the community needs, because we are always changing, our needs are always changing, but ultimately they will always serve the role of places of community and gathering, and I think that's a core value that we have to keep close to ourselves. And so while we are reorganizing ourselves, we have to keep in mind, what do we have capacity for? Because I know for me, like, I love the boards that I'm a part of, I love the committees that I'm a part of, but I also recognize I have so much work and I am often like very tired and I can't keep up everything. So one thing that we can do as a community is like have these conversations of like, what are we able to do? How can we meet your needs? If you can't come to like a 2 or 3 hour meeting, what can we do instead? How often can we meet? How do we make it accessible for multiple people in our communities based off our class, based off where we live in the city? Because some people don't have access to cars. It's hard to come out here. Like, what are other ways we can, where are other places we can meet and how can we meet? I think those are the things that come to mind when I think of that question.
Thank you, Hanako. Terry, did you want to add to that? You don't have to, just if you have.
I actually don't have a lot to add because I don't live in Winnipeg, never lived in Winnipeg. Well, I did live in Winnipeg for a while, but where we were, there were a lot of other Japanese Canadians. There were a couple of families, but which we would visit from time to time. But really, by the time I grew up on the farm, there were no Japanese Canadian workers at all there anymore. Went to a one-room schoolhouse very close to where we lived, grade 1 to 8. Didn't have any other Japanese Canadians there as well. Even in the high school that I went to in Portage, there were 2 high schools. One was inside the town where most of the kids went to, but the other one, Artemian, was at the edge of town, and a lot of the kids from Southport, the Air Force Base, were there, and that's where a lot of rural kids went. The Air Force Base was very transient, so you didn't make a lot of friends from those people there, and being from the farm, you just get bused back and forth, so didn't really associate with a lot of the kids there. Anyway, getting back to the question of is this center important? Probably more than ever. In the world, the way the world is working right now, centers like this are incredibly important to maintain identity. I find it ironic that during the war, the biggest complaint that the government had, or the ruling party had then, was, the Japanese Canadians won't assimilate, they can't assimilate, and therefore we don't want them. Everybody now doesn't want to assimilate. That's what folk art is about. Everybody wants their own identity and keep it, preserve it, and relish it, and keep it going. So that's what we're doing now with the center, and I think it's a wonderful thing, especially in this day and age when we want everybody to be recognized, all cultures to be respected, and all peoples should be respected. I mean, I'm not going to talk about the States, but anyway, that's what I think is important about the center.
Thank you, Terry. Thank you. I think you kind of mentioned at the end there, Terry, because we're in a state right now where things are very polarized, right? And each of you talked about the importance of a community space like this. You talked about, Junko, you talked about your kids having a space where they can be with other Japanese kids, where they can learn more about their culture, right? Because I know for me as a parent, it's hard for me to be able to teach my kids all. And so having them involved in different things within the community, we kind of really bring the community together. James, you talked about being a safe space, right? And that was the purpose of having any community in the Japanese community serve as having a safe space for everyone. And the importance of identity, keeping that together. And to me, the question is, why do we even need to ask why we should have a place like this in the future? It should just be, right? For anyone who needs to have their culture, they should have a space just like the JCAM has. So thank you. Next questions we have, we're going to go through the individual questions. I think just looking at the time, we have about 5 minutes to 6, 7 minutes or so per each panelist. So maybe Junko, okay if I start with you again. So having been born in Japan and chosen to live in Canada, how important is it for you to maintain Japanese culture and identity?
Yeah, so I've mentioned this a little bit earlier, but when I came here when I was 23, I wasn't really thinking about my identity or my Japanese heritage or culture. But when I became a mother, that's when I started to really think about what it means to be Japanese in this society, the multicultural society. And I've been coming here volunteering at different programs before I had children, and I've seen my community members in different stages, and I see that the importance of getting involved and having the community to support each other, because like you said, you can't teach kids, just parents, about everything. So then the community and other family in this similar situation is a huge support, especially when it comes to culture. And yeah, I feel like because I was born in Japan, and I feel even more responsible to pass down what I know or what I've been inherited. And I'm from Nagasaki, so of course the atomic bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki often comes up in the conversation. And again, I have revisited that part of my family history, and I found out more about part of my father's side family were affected by that. So more and more I think about and what I want to pass down to my children and the future generation. I just dig back more and more to my connection in Japan. So, yeah.
Thank you. I'm going to pass it off to James. James, having 2 young children who have mixed identity, how are you planning to make sure that they know who they are culturally?
Yeah, good question. And since that question was supposed to have another child, so there's 3 now, so they're growing. But it's a good question, and it's something that I find it kind of interesting what Junko just said when she said she became a mother. That was like a point in a big shift in connecting with that, and I would say the same thing. So in 2017, our first son was born. His name, we call him Monty. His name is Montero, and for us, for my wife and I, as I mentioned before, we're very multicultural. So European descent on one side and Japanese on the other side. And my wife is Sri Lankan, Sinhala, Sri Lankan, 100%, right? So when we were thinking about what we name our kids, and my wife's name is Hesanta. And as you might imagine, as she grew up, English was her first language, we went to the same schools and everything, but people struggle pronouncing her name, right? And so it's something that that we always thought, well, what will we name our kids? And this is a question that everybody asks themselves. My mother and my aunt were Shirley and Peggy, full Japanese, right? My grandfather's name was Junichi, but he went by John. My grandmother's name was Yai, and she just went by Yai, because it was so short, right? But there was always this question intergenerationally of how can you appear, I guess, it's not really Canadian, they were born in Canadian, how do you appear more white and less Japanese? And because that was what was generally accepted. And that's the question they've always asked. And then at some point in the 1990s, I'm growing up, and I'm a mixed ethnicity kid, the previous generations, including mom, are always like, well, how do I be secretly Japanese? And it's what I feel like the question they always ask themselves. But then in the 1990s, Japanese culture became very popular. Nintendo, anime, even Star Wars is based off of Japanese Buddhism. Like, just Japan became popular culture. Sushi, everything. So at some point that shifted, and I remember my wife and I thinking, well, how are we going to reflect our culture, our ethnic diversity in our kids' names? And so we decided, well, we would do a combination. And so then Monty is Montero, and then Masanori, and then our daughter's name is Serena. They have Sinhala middle names. Actually, Serena is a girl's name that's in both Sri Lankan culture and Japanese, because they're both Buddhist countries, right? They have Buddhist roots, right? So, but they always have English last names. My dad is English, so Sinnock, right? English, Irish. And so the names become very representative of our culture. And sometimes I think of that as a bit of a microcosm of what JCAM should be. And that's really it. It's like every kid, including myself, my sister, my cousins, have always asked themselves, whether they said it to their parents or not, they always ask themselves, what is my identity? Because being Japanese Canadian is different than being a mixed ethnicity Japanese Canadian. And I think that that's something that people always lose. And they think, oh, well, I'm like Hanako was saying, that question about, am I Japanese enough? Do I fit in? Do I have ownership over being a member of whether it's JCAM or anything else? But kids are always just asking, what's my identity? They want to know where they fit in. And I think that's the important thing with Redress and internment and that, is it's really hard to know your identity if you don't know where you came from. And it's the same thing that happened, it's a colonization, it's right at the colonization playbook. Same thing with indigenous communities, same thing with other minorities. If you don't have your family, your roots, you don't know where you came from, it's hard to know where you should go. And so that's, whether it's Surrey, Maple Ridge, you're born in Winnipeg, whatever it is, whether the history is good or bad, if you don't know it, it's hard to be proud of it. And I think that that's the thing. And so I have kids now that are very multicultural, and they don't know what a Makoshi is. They don't know what, a temple looks like in Sri Lanka. They don't know any of that stuff. but it doesn't really matter. All they need to know is that they need to be proud of who they are. And I think that that's, and they need to be comfortable with being different. You know, they need to be resilient when people say that you're different than other people, and they need to be okay with that. I think that's something that my wife and I really try to demonstrate to the kids, and I think it's something that's in this Japanese community is different. It's hard for people to relate to and understand the perspective of a half Caucasian, half Japanese kid, their own kid, and understand what that experience is. So anyway, that's, yeah, the multiculturalism thing. That's a big deal, okay?
Thanks, James. Hanako, a question for you. As a student and writer of mixed race, do you identify closer to one background or not? And how will this impact on you in your future work?
I feel like my answer again is gonna go off of James's answer. Just where to answer your question, I do feel more connected to my Japanese heritage, but that's just because of like how I grew up. But I think it's really important to acknowledge just because I grew up closer to that side and that I connect to that side doesn't mean that I don't acknowledge and I'm not proud of also my Irish heritage. Like, I am a firm believer, like, my mixed identity does not make me half. It doesn't make me a part. I'm not a part of separate things. I am whole. And so I think one thing that's really helped me is understand that, like, being a mixed kid and growing up, it's not you're 50% of this, you're 25% of this, you're 100%. Because, like, ultimately, like, the identities I have as, like, mixed or queer, they are part of my identities, but they do not define me. Like, ultimately, I am myself, and those are just parts of myself. And so, of course, that's going to impact my work. I do work as, like, an activist, as a writer and a scholar, and I bring in all of those identities into my work because I have to consider my positionality, where I'm coming from, where I'm writing from, what are my experiences that allow me to see on the margins, but then also what am I missing? What are my blind spots? Because like, while I do come from marginalized communities, I come from an upper middle class family. I have a blind spot there. Like, I don't have experiences other people are gonna have. So when I go into my activist or creative or scholarly work, I consider all of those things. And I think they all tie really strongly together because, like, while I was growing up, I didn't see any representation of Asian, any queer, any mixed representation within the books I was reading, the TV shows that I was watching. Even, like, growing up, we grew up in, like, a predominantly white neighborhood, so I didn't see myself, which led me to not have a lot of self-worth or have a lot of doubt. And I think what James said about not knowing where you come from and being unrooted is a main cause for a lot of these things. So when I go to do my work, I think, where are the gaps? Where am I not seeing myself? Where am I not seeing people who look like me? And how can I work to fill in those gaps? And it's not just me, it's many, many, many others. There's a strong movement of young people who want to see themselves and who will make themselves seen. Because I don't think we're just going to sit here anymore. I think there's a strong desire to take action on all of our parts.
Thank you. That's really powerful. Terry, as a son of a mother who is an internee and father who was a sugar beet farmer that had Japanese Canadian workers, what impact has this had when growing up and even for today?
Well, actually, as I was growing up, as I mentioned, it was on the farm. There were no Japanese Canadians at all on the farm anymore. A couple of families were in Oakville and in Portage la Prairie, and we, had some contact with them. But most of the mom and mom's brothers and sisters were mostly in Winnipeg. So our neighbors were all white. And when I went to school and high school, most of the people there were white. I guess I was lucky when we were growing up. You know, again, the Wenham Schoolhouse, there was no discrimination that I could detect because we were the only, different kids there, my brother and I, and all the neighbors knew each other. They grew up together. High school at that time, at the end of the 60s and getting into the early 70s, it was starting to be kind of cool to be different growing up time for me. And when I hit university in the early 70s, it was actually pretty cool to be different. Quick little story, went to Europe in the early 70s for a couple of months. There were no Asians traveling at that time. There was no Chinese, there was no Japanese, there was nobody. And I stood out like a sore thumb in a way. But it was different. Everybody couldn't figure out what I was. I remember one time I'm in Greece, I'm in a taverna bar, and sitting around with a bunch of other students, talking away, etc. And there was this English girl at the next table. She kept staring at me, and I thought, okay, here it comes. Somebody else wondering what's going on. And finally, she couldn't stand it any longer, and she said, I give up. What are you? And I said, I'm Canadian. You're an Eskimo. Okay. Close. No. So, I had to tell her the truth, and suddenly she wasn't very interested anymore. So growing up for me was a little bit different. People were always wondering, but again, mixed, right? Your dad's Irish, Scottish, and your mom's Japanese Canadian. You don't quite fit in one way or the other necessarily, but you are accepted on both sides. Growing up again, Christmas was at Grandma Tully's, where we grew up. And there's brothers and sisters of dad come with their kids, and it was a packed house because it was a big family, and it was traditional, right? Turkey, mashed potatoes, gravy, etc., etc. New Year's Day was Grandpa Mukai's in Portage La Prairie, and all the sisters and brothers and kids would come from Winnipeg and descend on there, and then it was really good food. It was rice cakes, it was all the Japanese food, and it was wonderful. And at that time, sushi was only served on special occasions. So for me, this was heaven on earth, because it was food that we only got on at special times. So you're living in one world and in another world too. It was not difficult, but it was interesting, and both sides of the family got along, so that was the best part. I know maybe that doesn't answer your question, but that's just the way things were for me personally.
No, thank you. I think it does. I mean, you talked about how you have to navigate, your identities in different ways. It depends on where you are. Some of your identity will come out in another way than, like the family gatherings and events.
One other small thing I guess I will say, is with Cultural Center here, it made it easier for me to, gather that side of me, the Japanese Canadian side. But when they made the documentary Facing Injustice, that really had me have to focus more on who I was, where I came from, and how we got here. And I remember another quick little story, but there was, we have a How to Write colony right beside us, and they're very progressive. And one of the teachers there, what she was doing is she was going to different ethnic groups or individuals to say, can you come to my class and tell us how you got here? And she approached my mother, and Mom pawned it on me. So then I had to do some research. Like, so how did we get here? So I'm interviewing my own mother about all this information and then going through books, etc., going to the internet, and went to the class, and almost the school is there, etc. So I told the story of how we got here. And afterwards, one of the other teachers came up, who I knew very well, and he said, you know, we've been neighbors all our lives. And I had never had a clue about this. I had no idea that any of this occurred. And that's why this place should be here.
Thank you, Terry. So we have quite a bit of time here left. I do want to ask and give the opportunity for any of the panelists, if they want to ask each other questions, you can do that of each other. So you can sit on that for a little bit. But one thing I'm wondering, because it is the 36th anniversary of the Japanese-Canadian Redress Agreement, can you maybe in 1 or 3 words describe, and I'm making assumptions here, how important this day is? So in 1 or 2 words.
In my mind, it just changed the way Canada looks at Japanese Canadians. It's a culmination of telling a story that, again, as I mentioned before, a lot of people don't know about or didn't know about. And it's important that they do know about it, and that it was the start of other groups being able to seek redress as well, or be recognized also.
Thank you.
So I'll sum it up perfect, saying 1 word, and I would just say justice. I think that, so I was 3 when that happened, and so I was a little kid, and I think about my 3-year-old son who was just, running around the house, and I remember that my mom and dad called Art and my grandparents who were in touch with Art when it happened, just to talk about it and provide details of it. And it was such I don't think I understood exactly at the time. As a 3-year-old, you don't get what's going on. But it was such a powerful moment for them. And actually since, when I was on the board and Art and Keiko had helped me find some information about the story of my grandparents and what happened to them and how they ended up moving to Manitoba and so on. And it was just some really incredible documentation about where they came from, and their families were just told to pack a suitcase and get on a train, and they were in Winnipeg. And I always remember thinking about what was going through my grandma and my grandpa's minds at that time. And I always had this perception that they were kids, because that's what they always told me. But when you look at the interment papers, and I looked at the dates, and I was like, wait a second. My grandmother was 20 years old. My grandfather was 25 years old. They knew exactly what happened to them, and they just didn't want to talk about it. And I had the opportunity to go to, when I was on the board, to go to Japan in 2019 as part of this Japan Ministry of Foreign Affairs leadership kind of tour. And I had never been to Asia. No one in my mother's side of the family had lived in Japan since 1901. And I went there, and it was this country of like 130 million people that all looked like one side of my family. And it just like blew my mind away. And I realized though, after coming back from that, how quintessentially Japanese that was for like that generation of people to go through internment, face that racism, and say, you know what, you can take my whole life away, you can take our farms away, but don't separate our families. And they just moved to the worst, coldest place in Canada and just endure it and not talk about it. And I know like Art's generation, other people who, Terry's family, his generation, would say, why didn't you tell us? why did you wait so long? But I think back and I'm like, oh, they're so Japanese of them. They're just gonna, if you go to Tokyo now, they have like a tsunami or like an earthquake. The whole city's destroyed. They just rebuild it. That's it. They just do it. And it's so, that's something about being Japanese that you can't take away. It doesn't matter if you're half Japanese, quarter Japanese, full Japanese, new immigrant to Canada. That's part of you. There's some things that I was shocked that it's just who you are, and it's kind of shocking sometimes. But just look at these centers. Look at these centers across Canada. This is a group of people that are builders, right? So it's anyway. It's just kind of feeding off of what redress meant, and I think we owe it to future generations to really show them, travel, to show them what their identity is, know where they came from, to give them names that represent their culture, to give them the opportunity to celebrate who they are, or not celebrate who they are, but just be okay with being proud to be Japanese or being mixed ethnicity, Japanese, English, Irish. And this is Hanako's experience, Terry's experience too, is I think of myself, once I got that information from her, and I was like, why do I have all this history on my English side of my family? My grandfather on my dad's side was a World War II vet. Knew so much about them. And I knew nothing about my grandparents. And only the photos that they had of us as grandkids. And it was so, and I thought to myself, wait a second, these are the same people. They were both fourth generation. They were both, one side was Japanese, one side was white. Same people. They immigrated, one side from Europe, one side from Japan, 1901. The same people, born in Canada, and I was like, what a different experience it was if you were a white Canadian versus a Japanese Canadian. What a different experience it is if you're an Indigenous Canadian, if you're a Black Canadian, any cross section. Like it's remarkable. But I think that for younger generations, you can't hide from that. You can't. Those are important conversations to have with your kids. I think of my own kids, and they go to school now. My experience is when I went to school, the only person who looked like me was my sister. And the only person who was mixed ethnicity, Japanese, the only Japanese person in school. But now, my kid goes to a French immersion school. He's the only kid who looks like him, other than his siblings. And he always will. He's half Sri Lankan, Japanese, white, all mixed. And it's really interesting. It's not different. It's the same. It's the same story. Junko's story is the same as my great-grandparents in 1901. It's the same story. So it's important to have centers like this, places to go, places to be proud, places to educate, to learn, even things like scholarships for kids, other sports activities, connections with the Buddhist temple. Like those are things that need to continue. Thank you.
Yeah, I think for me, redress came before I was born, so it was something that I was taught later on in life, but the word that comes to mind is pride. Pride because we did it. Our community did it. Like, I know we talk about the support of like white Canadians, but like our community did the actions, our community took the steps to get that done. And I think we should take credit for that and be proud of ourselves for that. And I think bringing that legacy forward, when we see injustice, it is our turn to act as well. When we see institutes of oppression hurting our brothers and sisters, when we see genocide across the world, it is our responsibility to act. It is in our blood, it is in our heritage. And so that's what I am reminded of this day.
Thank you, Hanako. Junko?
Yes, Redress. As a first generation newcomers, I find that this movement, of course I did not know about it until I came to Canada and I started to talk to JC members. Then it hit me that I thought the grandma and grandpa people here, I thought they were just like my great grandparents, but they were different. And I realized there was a difference between my people, the generation. And I realized, oh, I need to learn all about this. And I feel the word that came to my mind is the responsibility. And I'm honored to get to know Art because Art is the one who signed the agreement. And I'm happy to continue to be part of the education that the future children should know about the redress. So we started a committee to produce a kid's story in a kamishibai form, and I think that's a good start for our community to spread the word about the JC history, and also not just the Japanese Canadians, but all school system in Canada in the way that children can understand.
Thank you. So we have 2 minutes left. If panelists don't have questions for each other, or maybe a question from an audience, if you have, we have 2 minutes. If not, I will close it off.
Just wanted to ask the older panel here. Just wanted to ask the older panel here that, Nagasaki, I think you're probably the first person I ever met from Nagasaki ever. And then, but I wanted to talk to just maybe hear a bit, understand. So generations back, and same with generations from you that were relocated. Did you see a lot of anger in like your ancestors, for the bombing, and also to the anger for the relocation?
You're talking to me?
Yeah, both you.
Okay.
Did you witness anger like in like your parents or grandparents?
No.
For that?
No, they as they've been saying, they never talked about it really. I mean, Mom would mention it from time to time, but really not into detail. Don't forget, for my mom, she was a kid at the time. So being relocated to New Denver at Slocan Lake, it's a beautiful place. She learned to swim there. She learned to ice skate. For her, it was a great time. For my grandparents, it wasn't, but they never talked about it, that experience. No, the only people who got angry were me and my brother when we found out what happened. We went, what? And we actually went to see where the little farm was that my grandfather had in Port Hammond, now Maple Ridge, and it's a suburb now. Can you imagine what that was worth? That's what they lost.
I was just thinking about my father. He passed away last year. He was 82. He remembered the day Japan lost and all the American landed. The Sasebo city was, there was a military naval base was in Sasebo, so that city was bombed by the American aircraft. So it was, one time it was a sea of fire, and my father and his family evacuated to a different city. So they weren't in Nagasaki. But I remember him telling me all the story about American soldiers riding on the Jeep, throwing the chocolate Hershey chocolate candies off the back of the truck. And my father and his friends were chasing after the Jeep. And first English word that he remembered was, "Give me chocolate," because they were starving. They had nothing to eat. At that time, Japan was so poor, they didn't have any rice, nothing to eat. And they were trading kimonos, silk kimono, going to a farmland and ask them to trade with any food they have because city people did not have anything to eat. And he remembered this so clearly. So when he came to Canada, my parents visited in Winnipeg, and he saw Hersey candy in grocery store. He wanted to buy like 20 of them. And I said, sure, anything, just get anything you want. That's his favorite chocolate. And I know like maybe Lin's chocolate is better, but no, Hersey. That is like, in his memory, that's the best tasting food that he had. Back then he was 5 or something. And then his father, my grandfather died during the war, and I think my grandfather was 38 or something. And of course he did not come back. And we have the picture of the young person in the military outfit. And I've been told that this is your grandfather. And I kept looking at the pictures, like, how come he's younger than you? And when I was little, I didn't understand that. And then eventually I learned the war and what happened. And he had this longing to not, because he did not grow up with his father, I think that somehow psychologically affected him in many ways. And I start to understand that now. Now I have my boys and I realize, oh, my father grew up like that, not having his own father. He was raised by his grandmother. And so the word affecting the individual family it's a generational trauma. And also, it's not that long ago. This is my father, and this is the grandfather that I did not know, and we only have a picture. And I think all my friends probably can talk about very similar story about war. And from my father's point of view, me married to a Canadian person, a white person, was a shock for him. He did not accept it at the beginning. He did not want to meet my husband now, my ex, but he didn't want to meet until 3 days before the wedding in Winnipeg. And he had to struggle that. He had to overcome that idea of my daughter marrying to this white guy that he remember as American soldier throwing candy off the truck. So I just try to imagine the difficulty that he went through, that as an only daughter made him suffer. So yeah, that's my story.
The word that you really mentioned there, you really resonated with me, was the trauma. And with our people, that's something that really kind of lingers, is the trauma, and how do we get over that? And in what I see in cultural language is so important to instill in generations to come, and land as well.
Thank you, Clayton. You have one more. Well, I know we're going to go on a short break, but I guess we're okay. We are. Continue. It's a good conversation, so we'll continue.
First of all, I'd like to thank all the panelists. This is great. Really great to hear the different perspectives. But I question, especially for Hanako and James, comment being a Hapa Japanese Canadian is a lot different from being a Japanese Canadian. And I know that in 2011 census, there were 38,820 Japanese couples living in Canada. And 78.7% of those were mixed marriages. Way higher than any other ethnic minority. Way higher. And so there's way more Hapas in our community than there are so the future of the Japanese Canadian organization is probably different, I don't know, than say the Jewish community or the Sri Lankan or the Indian, or your thoughts on that?
Go first. Good question, Les. Very good question. I think Art loses sleep asking that question on a daily basis, but I don't know. I don't know exactly why that is. Well, I mean, one thing is I will say, like, I was a kid in the 90s. I was the only Japanese kid in my school, right? So we didn't live particularly close to one another. We would only see each other, even family, on holidays. Art has the history on why that would be, but long story short is that a lot of Japanese Canadians' families were spread out, and almost intentionally, with the lack of opportunity to rent properties and live in close proximity, which is another part of the history of the center and other organizations. But I'm not really sure. I know, like, my mom married a white guy, and then my aunt also did as well. And I don't, but keep in mind, there aren't in Manitoba, like, 20 or 2,000 to 3,000 Japanese Canadians. And so there's not a lot other than the new immigrants that come to Canada. But I will say this, in the Sri Lankan community, so my wife, as I said, her family came when she was 5, and the parents were first gen, and so they came very young. And now that next generation, there are very few marriages between two Sri Lankan people. And it's funny because she will often tell me, Hassan will tell me, that the parents worked tirelessly to try and keep their community, the Sri Lankan community, together. And they weren't marrying their kids off to one another, but they wanted to foster almost like a cultural organization where it was like a mini Sri Lanka. And in practice, they found that didn't work. They could go to a Buddhist temple, which was not the Manitoba Buddhist temple, a different Buddhist temple. They had a monk. They did practice cultural things. They don't have a full garden pavilion, but they did other things. And yet, the people grew up and married people of other ethnicities. And but keep in mind, like, so some people married Caucasian people, some people married people like me who are mixed ethnicity, and it's interesting. And I think that we often see that framework where it's like, same ethnicity marrying the same ethnicity, and it's in the United States you see that all the time. In Canada, I think we need to get away from the idea that there's a little bit of a cultural difference in Canada, and I think that we need to get away from those lines and boundaries of being something that's going to persist over a significant amount of time. I think it doesn't, and I find that it's really interesting. But I find growing up in a mixed ethnicity, like Japanese Canadian and white father and Japanese Canadian mom, I grew up thinking, oh, maybe I don't fit in. And maybe I don't know, I've got white names, and maybe we don't practice a lot of Japanese culture. And then I grew up, and then I married my wife, and I'm like, why do we seem so similar? Like, and I'm like, oh my God, everything we did in our house was so Asian. It was so Japanese Canadian, which again is different than being Japanese. And I thought that was just such but all the things we used to do, like in the house and how we lived, were way more like my mother's side, and therefore more like my future wife's side, than they were like my dad's side. And but we never had that perception as kids. But anyway, it's interesting to see those dynamics, but the race question is always one that's there. But I think JCAM, we need to think of it as it's not going to be race-based anymore, although that was the start of JCAM. The JCAM was based on major human rights violations, and that is why it has its initial purpose, but its purpose moving forward is an evolution of that. So, to be continued.
I don't know if that much to say. My parents are in the audience, so, and like I'm mixed, so I don't really know if I want to answer this. But I will say, like, I talked to my grandma and grandpa about it, and they had two different answers. Where my grandpa said, You know, like what James said, Japanese people were like strategically separated from each other, and one of the last restrictions that was lifted was the proximity of like, okay, you guys can live together now, but for a long time that was very much policed. And so he used the belief that like, well, part of it is probably because like there was a separation and you just don't know Japanese people in your community, so you just don't get to know them, and then you don't get married to them, or like you don't build any type of relationship with them. And my grandma was of the belief you love who you love, and I think there's a healthy middle between that, because yeah, I mean, definitely there's systemic racism at play in that number, but there's also like, I guess it would have to depend on when the next consensus comes out, but I do think there is something of that of like, you're gonna love who you're gonna love. So it's kind of a wishy-washy answer, but midway point between those two.
No, thank you. I actually looked it up. Currently, according to recent stats, there's 1,400 Japanese that consider themselves Japanese descent in Manitoba, so not a lot. I know high schools that are bigger than that.
I challenge that number. 2021 census is 2,770.
There you go. Like I said, I just look it up. It's not accurate, but it is.
This is the Government of Canada census.
I will say I do believe that there is something to do with systemic racism at play, and like living in like Canada, which is like a white nationalist country at heart and a colonial country. I think like something that we are taught as like marginalized communities is to feel bad and like hate our own marginalized identities. That's something that inadvertently Canada kind of teaches us, and that's just part of the curriculum, unfortunately. And there are groups that are striving to push against that, but it is definitely part of growing up. So yeah.
I just want to clarify, I didn't really want to ask, like, why do we have such a high? I mean, I have other reasons also I could offer that why we have so much high, but more in terms of the implications for the future of the community. We're going to be a diluted community, more so than other ethnic minorities, because of the high rates of intermarriage, and it's just continuing, it's even accelerating. And there's many reasons for that, but forget about that, but what's the future of our community?
Okay, that makes a lot more sense. I think, again, like, I think being able to determine that and to recognize that mixed race identity is very different than like a Japanese identity. And often, like, I know growing up and talking to people around my age, there's a feeling of not being accepted by white communities, and then also not being accepted by Asian communities because you're not enough of either. And I think the future of this community is going to have to be able to look at that and recognize that experience and like be an invitation in of like, you are enough. Like that's the first thing that people have to know, like you are enough based off any of your identity. I know from my experience as well, like there are a lot of queer mixed people and like a lot of queer youth, and that is another barricade that I don't think we talk about, that queer people do not feel invited into these communities. And that just might be, like, I know for me, I thought that it was like a very traditional space, and I didn't think that that would be very like well received or welcomed, and so that was super scary for me. And then meeting certain people where like, I met other queer Japanese people and mixed people, and I was like, oh, I am welcome here. There's other people like me here. And so I think the future will have to consider all of those different intersections of identity, because it's also just not like Caucasian and Japanese, like that is not the only mix. And I think that's something that we often assume, but that's not the case. And it's so, how do we make it open and accessible to everyone? And that's looking at like, how can we cause the least amount of harm? So for example, like if we want to have partnerships with other communities and like invite people in, it's like, okay, so if we want people here, if we have a police presence at the event, who is that harming? Like the police are harmful to certain communities, and if we are going to have the future of having mixed ethnicities and mixed race If that is the future, which it is, we have to think about how can we cause the least amount of harm, and that's part of it. It's thinking of further.
Add one thing? Yeah, thank you. I think it's often forgotten the family member of the JC. So somebody married to the JC family, they are part of this community, no matter where they're from.
Yes.
Or people who love Japanese culture or Japanese anime or anything to do with Japanese, they're just part of this community. So I think the future ethnicity or the cultural background or the where the ancestor come from is starting to become more irrelevant. And I think this center is supported by people who just love Japan, related to Japanese stuff. So I think that's probably a good prospect way to expand the center.
Yeah, I agree.
Okay, sorry, James this will be the last, just because we have to continue time. I know we have some great conversations here.
I have one real quick comment. So Les, it's just gonna look, it's not gonna look as different as I think we think it's gonna look. So I have me and my cousins, and they have, so my wife is Sri Lankan, one cousin has 5 kids, and his wife's Filipino, and then another cousin lives in Calgary, and his wife is Thai. All of them are quarter Japanese. If I line up all 12 of those kids, or whatever it is, they look like they all fit. They're like, oh yeah, I can see it. And they're all a quarter Japanese. Like exactly what everyone here is saying. It's not as different as we think it's gonna look like. We're gonna live in a society where everybody's just kind of beige, you know? It's not gonna be that different. So it's, anyway, I'll leave it at that, so.
Well, thank you. And just, maybe if I just add a little bit to what you all were saying, to me it's, I think like you mentioned, James, it's going to be an evolution of who we are and who we define ourselves, because there is a lot of that coming from a Filipino Chinese, but also marrying into Ukrainian Mennonite. You know, that is also a question to many communities about, you know, the dilution. But to me, I don't think it's necessarily dilution, but it's an evolution of where we are currently. And I see a lot of teachings from the indigenous community, you know, with the elders holding those knowledge and passing those down. That's, I think, where some of our communities are missing, because we are disconnected to our elders. And those are the ones where we need to get the teachings and the passings, and we are identified core, the foundation of what makes who we are, whether we're Filipino, whether we're Japanese or not. I think those are the things that we need to find to reconnect with our elders. I will leave it as that. Thank you so much. I think we could have done probably another 2 hours of this or longer.